I'm a former Army combat medic who served 3 deployments in Iraq between 2007 and 2012. You can call me Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez if you want. During my 5 years of active duty, I saved dozens of lives under the most extreme conditions imaginable: roadside bombs, sniper attacks, mortar strikes, and every kind of trauma the human body can endure in a war zone. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one emergency that haunts me to this day, and the last words a dying soldier whispered to me that made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. Words that ultimately led me to leave the military entirely and completely change my understanding of what it means to be human. I never intended to become a soldier, let alone a combat medic. Growing up in East Los Angeles, I was the first person in my family to graduate high school. My parents, both immigrants from El Salvador, worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table and pay rent on our small apartment. College seemed like an impossible dream, something for kids whose parents could afford tuition and living expenses. When I was 18, our Army recruiter visited our high school during lunch period. He talked about job training, educational benefits, and the opportunity to serve something bigger than yourself. What caught my attention wasn't the patriotic speech, it was the medical training. He explained how Army medics learn skills that could translate directly into civilian healthcare careers: emergency medicine, trauma care, patient assessment, procedures that took years to learn in civilian programs. I enlisted with the military occupational specialty of 68W MES Healthcare Specialist, or what everyone called a combat medic. After basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, I was sent to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio for 16 weeks of intensive medical training. We learned everything from basic anatomy and physiology to advanced trauma life support procedures, how to start IVs under pressure, how to manage airways in critically injured patients, how to perform emergency surgical procedures that could mean the difference between life and death. But nothing in that training prepared me for what combat medicine actually looks like. No classroom can simulate the chaos of treating multiple casualties while incoming mortar rounds are exploding around your position. No mannequin can replicate the psychological impact of working on someone who's barely older than your little brother, knowing that his life depends entirely on your ability to perform medical procedures you've only practiced a handful of times. My first deployment was to Iraq in 2007, assigned to the 1st Infantry Division operating out of Forward Operating Base Liberty in Baghdad. I was 19 years old, barely 6 months out of medical training, and completely unprepared for the reality of war. The senior medics took me under their wing and taught me things you can't learn from textbooks: how to improvise medical equipment from whatever supplies are available, how to triage multiple casualties when you don't have enough resources for everyone, how to make life and death decisions in seconds rather than minutes. My second deployment, which began in March 2009, took me to Forward Operating Base Crimson in Al-Anbar Province, Western Iraq. This was during the height of what military historians now call the Anbar Awakening, when Sunni tribal leaders began cooperating with coalition forces against Al-Qaeda insurgents. But cooperation didn't mean peace ends, it just changed the nature of the violence we encountered daily. FOB Crimson was a sprawling dust-covered installation built around what had once been an Iraqi military base. The previous occupants had abandoned it during the 2003 invasion, leaving behind concrete buildings that we converted into barracks, command centers, medical facilities and dining areas. The base housed approximately 1,200 personnel from multiple units, Marine infantry battalions, Army logistics companies, Air Force personnel, Navy Seabees, and various support elements from coalition partners. The base sat in the middle of what we called the Triangle of Death, a region roughly bounded by Ramadi, Fallujah, and Lake Habbaniyah. This area had been a stronghold for insurgent activity since the beginning of the Iraq War. Roadside bombs were a daily occurrence. Mortar attacks happened so frequently that most soldiers didn't even stop their conversations when the incoming alarm sounded. They just moved to the nearest concrete shelter and continued talking. My medical station was located in what had once been an Iraqi officer's quarters, a reinforced concrete building with thick walls that could withstand mortar impacts. I had converted the main room into a treatment area, equipped with everything necessary for trauma stabilization: IV fluids and blood products, airway management equipment, surgical instruments, medications for pain control and life support. The back room served as a minor surgery area, where I could perform procedures that were too complex for field conditions but didn't require a full operating room. As the senior combat medic for the 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, I was responsible for providing immediate medical care to anyone who came through our gates. That included not just our soldiers, but Iraqi civilians, coalition forces from other countries, and even detained insurgents when necessary. The Geneva Convention requires medical personnel to treat all casualties regardless of their status or which side they're fighting for. In practice, this meant that I sometimes found myself treating the same people who had been trying to kill our soldiers just hours before. The heat in Al Anbar province was unlike anything I had experienced growing up in Los Angeles. During summer months, temperatures regularly exceeded 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Then the humidity was so low that sweat evaporated before you could feel it on your skin. The desert sand was like powder. It got into everything: your equipment, your food, your medical supplies, your lungs. You learned to work in conditions that would shut down most civilian hospitals. Equipment malfunctioned constantly due to sand and heat. IV bags would be hot to the touch from sitting in the sun. Medications required special storage to prevent them from degrading in the extreme temperatures. When the base came under attack, which happened at least twice a week, you continued treating patients while explosions rocked the building around you. The first few times I would instinctively duck or flinch when mortar rounds impacted nearby. After a few months, you learn to distinguish between incoming and outgoing fire, between mortar impacts that were close enough to be dangerous and those that were just making noise. You develop the ability to continue medical procedures while part of your brain tracked the tactical situation outside. The power grid was unreliable at best. During surgical procedures, the electricity would frequently cut out without warning. You learned to work by flashlight and headlamp until the backup generators kicked in. Sometimes the generators would fail too, and you'd complete entire medical procedures using nothing but the light from chemical glow sticks and whatever illumination came through the windows. In a combat zone, you develop daily routines that help maintain some semblance of normalcy in an environment where nothing is normal. Morning sick calls started at 0700 hours. Soldiers with minor medical issues that needed attention before they went on patrol or duty assignments. Heat rash, gastrointestinal problems, minor cuts and sprains, medication refills for chronic conditions like asthma or diabetes. These routine medical encounters helped maintain the illusion that we were still practicing normal medicine, even though everyone knew that the real work began when the radio crackled with reports of casualties incoming. Equipment maintenance was a constant requirement. Medical equipment in a combat environment takes tremendous abuse: stress, sand, heat, vibration from explosions, and constant use by multiple people who aren't always gentle with expensive instruments. I spent at least 2 hours every day cleaning, calibrating, and testing equipment to ensure it would function properly when needed. IV pumps, cardiac monitors, ventilators, surgical instruments, everything required daily maintenance to prevent failures during critical procedures. Training sessions with junior medics were scheduled for slow periods, though slow was a relative term at FOB Crimson. I was responsible for training soldiers from other units in combat lifesaver procedures, basic first aid skills that could keep someone alive until a trained medic arrived, how to apply tourniquets properly, how to manage airways in unconscious patients, to how to treat sucking chest wounds using improvised materials. These skills had saved countless lives throughout the Iraq War, but they required constant practice to maintain proficiency. But when the radio burst to life with reports of casualties inbound, everything else stopped immediately. You had maybe 5 minutes to prepare your treatment area for whatever was coming through that door. Those 5 minutes were critical: burst laying out instruments, preparing IV fluids, checking medication dosages, mentally reviewing trauma protocols for different types of injuries, because once the casualties arrived, there would be no time to think, only time to act based on training and experience. During my 3 deployments to Iraq, I treated over 400 wounded soldiers, Marines, civilians, and enemy combatants. Blast injuries from improvised explosive devices that could turn a human body into something barely recognizable. Gunshot wounds from sniper attacks that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from blood loss. Burns from vehicle fires that covered 30 to 40% of a patient's body surface. Traumatic amputations from roadside bombs that left soldiers conscious and alert while missing entire limbs. You see things in combat medicine that no civilian emergency room doctor will ever encounter, even in the busiest trauma centers in major cities. A 19-year-old soldier with his leg attached to his body by nothing more than a few tendons and bone fragments, but still trying to walk because he doesn't want to leave his squad behind. A Marine whose body armor saved his life but couldn't prevent massive internal bleeding from the overpressure wave of an explosion. An Iraqi child, maybe 8 years old, brought in by her father after being caught in crossfire between insurgents and coalition forces, with injuries that no child should ever have to endure. The psychological impact of treating these injuries, day after day, month after month, is something that military medicine doesn't adequately prepare you for. You develop what we called medics detachment, the psychological defense mechanism that allows you to focus on the medical procedures instead of the human suffering in front of you. You stop seeing casualties as someone's son or daughter, someone's husband or wife, someone with dreams and plans for the future. They become a set of symptoms to treat, injuries to stabilize, vital signs to monitor and maintain. It sounds cold and inhuman when I describe it that way, but it's the only psychological survival mechanism that allows you to function effectively when you're dealing with this level of trauma on a regular basis. If you allowed yourself to think too much about the person behind the injuries, about their family back home, about the life they had planned before this happened to them, you would become paralyzed by the emotional weight of it all. And paralyzed medics don't save lives. After 2.5 years of treating battlefield trauma, my medical philosophy had become straightforward and proven through experience. Follow your training religiously, work systematically through established trauma protocols, and focus entirely on getting patients alive to the next level of care. Combat medicine operates on what we call the golden hour concept. You have roughly 60 minutes from the time of injury to get a trauma patient to definitive surgical care, or their chances of survival drop dramatically with each passing minute. My job as a combat medic wasn't to perform miracles or save everyone who came through my treatment area. That kind of thinking leads to poor decision-making and wasted resources that could be better used on patients with survivable injuries. My job was to buy critically injured patients enough time to reach a proper trauma center with real surgeons, operating rooms, blood banks, and all the advanced medical equipment that I simply didn't have available at a forward operating base. The ABCs of trauma medicine became second nature: airway, breathing, circulation. Ensure the patient has a clear airway and can move air in and out of their lungs. If they can't breathe, nothing else you do matters. Control any obvious bleeding through direct pressure, pressure bandages, or tourniquets when necessary. Establish intravenous access, and begin fluid replacement to treat shock and maintain blood pressure. Assess for other life-threatening injuries, and treat them in order of priority. Call for the fastest helicopter evacuation possible while continuing supportive care. I had learned, through painful experience, not to become emotionally attached to outcomes that were ultimately beyond my control. Some patients you manage to save, despite horrific injuries that should theoretically be fatal. The human body's capacity for surviving trauma can be remarkable when everything goes right with treatment and evacuation. Other patients die from complications of wounds that initially seemed completely survivable, despite receiving perfect medical care according to established protocols. Combat medicine teaches you that death doesn't always follow the logical rules you learned in medical training. Sometimes patients with relatively minor injuries develop complications that cascade into fatal outcomes, infections that don't respond to antibiotics, internal bleeding that doesn't show obvious external signs, traumatic brain injuries that seem minor initially, but prove fatal within hours. Other times, patients survive injuries that should have killed them instantly, defying every medical prediction about survivability and recovery. The key to maintaining sanity as a combat medic was accepting that you could only control the quality of care you provided in the immediate moment. You couldn't control whether the helicopter would be delayed by weather or enemy fire. You couldn't control whether the combat support hospital would have blood products available when your patient arrived. You couldn't control genetic factors that made some people more resilient to trauma than others. All you could control was your own knowledge, skills, and decision-making during the time the patient was under your care. Don't think about their families back home who would receive a phone call or visit from military personnel. Don't think about their plans for after deployment, the college they wanted to attend, the career they had chosen, the person they planned to marry. Don't think about the children they might never have or the parents they might never see again. Just focus on the immediate medical crisis in front of you and do everything within your power and training to keep them alive until they could reach definitive care. This emotional detachment was reinforced by the sheer volume of casualties we treated. During periods of heavy fighting, I might treat 15 to 20 wounded soldiers in a single day. If you allowed yourself to become emotionally invested in each individual case, the psychological burden would become unbearable within weeks. You had to maintain professional distance while still providing the best possible medical care. The incident that would forever change my understanding of life, death, and human consciousness occurred on March 7, 2011. During what had started as one of the quieter periods in our area of operations. It was early spring in Iraq, or still cool in the mornings with temperatures in the 60s, but warming up to the 90s by midday. The base had experienced a relatively peaceful 10 days with no major attacks, minimal insurgent activity, and a casualty flow that was lighter than we had seen in months. Charlie Company, 1st Platoon had departed FOB Crimson at 0600 hours for what was classified as a routine security patrol through the villages surrounding our area of operations. It was a mission type they had conducted dozens of times before, sitting with local tribal leaders to assess the security situation, showing coalition presence in areas where insurgent activity had been reported by intelligence sources, and gathering information about potential threats to base security. The patrol consisted of 4 up-armored M1114 Humvees carrying 16 soldiers total, led by 1st Lieutenant Rebecca Chen, a 25-year-old West Point graduate from Sacramento, California. Lieutenant Chen had been deployed to Iraq for approximately 10 months and had developed a reputation as one of the most competent platoon leaders in the battalion. Her soldiers trusted her judgment completely, and she had successfully led over 40 combat patrols without losing a single person under her command. The planned patrol route would take them through a series of small farming villages, connected by dirt roads that had been repeatedly targeted by insurgents for improvised explosive device placement over the past 2 years. Our explosive ordnance disposal teams conducted regular sweeps of these routes, but the insurgents had become increasingly sophisticated in their bomb-making techniques and concealment methods. They had learned to bury devices deep enough to avoid detection by standard metal detectors, or to use non-metallic containers packed with homemade explosives that were virtually impossible to spot during routine sweeps. The patrol had been on the road for approximately 7.5 hours, visiting 4 different villages and conducting meetings with local leaders. All contacts had been routine smoke reports of unusual insurgent activity, no signs of fresh IED placement, no indication that this day would be different from dozens of previous patrols. The soldiers were probably thinking about getting back to base, cleaning their equipment and grabbing dinner before the evening briefings. At approximately 13:47 hours, I was in my medical station updating patient records from the morning sick call, when the radio burst to life with an urgent transmission that immediately got my attention. "Base, this is Charlie 6. We have multiple urgent surgical casualties from an IED strike. Request immediate medical evacuation. We need medical personnel on site now." The tone in Lieutenant Chen's voice told me everything I needed to know about the severity of the situation. I had heard her on the radio dozens of times during routine patrol reports, and she always maintained perfect military composure and professional communication protocols. But this transmission carried an undertone of controlled panic that indicated she was dealing with casualties that were beyond the scope of basic combat lifesaver training. The explosion had occurred when the lead vehicle in their convoy triggered a massive improvised explosive device that had been buried in a drainage culvert beneath the dirt road. The insurgents had chosen their location carefully, natural choke point where the road narrowed between two irrigation ditches, forcing vehicles to follow a predictable path directly over the buried explosives. Intelligence analysis conducted later determined that the device contained approximately 300 pounds of homemade explosives packed into multiple 155 artillery shells and detonated by command wire from a concealed observation position about 200 meters away. The blast was so powerful that it created a crater 15 feet deep and 30 feet across, completely destroying the road surface and collapsing the drainage culvert underneath. The explosion could be heard at our base over 12 kilometers away, and the black smoke plume was visible from our guard towers within minutes of detonation. Lieutenant Chen's voice came through the radio again, maintaining professional composure despite the obvious stress of the situation. "Base, the lead vehicle took a direct hit from a large IED. Vehicle is completely destroyed. We have 3 urgent surgical casualties and 1 routine injury, all from the lead vehicle crew. We have established a helicopter landing zone, approximately 100 meters north of the blast site, and are maintaining security overwatch." Within 30 seconds of receiving that initial transmission, I was grabbing my medical kit and running toward the helicopter landing zone. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, my senior medic and closest friend at FOB Crimson, was right behind me carrying additional medical supplies and our field surgical kit. The medevac helicopter, an OUH-60 Black Hawk configured specifically for medical evacuation missions, was already spinning up on the landing pad, its crew having monitored the same radio frequency and begun their pre-flight procedures as soon as they heard the casualty report. As our helicopter lifted off from FOB Crimson and headed toward the blast site, I could see the thick black smoke rising from the impact area about 12 kilometers to the northeast. From our altitude of about 500 feet, the scope of the destruction became immediately apparent. 1 vehicle completely destroyed and still burning intensely. The other 3 vehicles in the convoy positioned in a defensive perimeter around the blast crater. Individual soldiers were visible moving around the scene, some obviously treating casualties while others maintained security positions in case of follow-up attacks or ambushes. When our helicopter touched down in the improvised landing zone that Lieutenant Chen's soldiers had marked with smoke grenades, she ran over to brief me on the casualty situation before I even had both feet on the ground. "Sergeant Vasquez, we have 3 soldiers from the lead vehicle with serious trauma injuries. Private First Class Johnson has multiple shrapnel wounds to both arms and torso, but she's conscious and her vital signs are stable. Specialist Rodriguez has what appears to be a traumatic brain injury and several broken ribs, also conscious and responsive. The critical casualty is Private Amanda Walsh. She was driving the lead vehicle when the IED detonated, and she took the worst of the blast impact." I grabbed my medical kit and followed Lieutenant Chen toward the area where the casualties had been moved to a relatively protected position behind one of the intact vehicles. As we ran across the uneven ground, she continued her briefing. "Walsh has been conscious and talking since immediately after the blast, but her injuries look severe. My soldiers have done everything they can with their combat lifesaver training, this fluids, pressure bandages, airway management, but she needs someone with your level of training immediately." What I found when I reached Private Amanda Walsh would fundamentally challenge everything I understood about survivable trauma, human physiology, and the relationship between consciousness and physical injury. It was the beginning of an experience that would haunt me for years, and ultimately lead me to question the most basic assumptions about life, death, and what it means to be human. Private Amanda Walsh was 20 years old, from a small farming town called Cedar Rapids in northern Minnesota. She had enlisted in the Army straight out of high school, motivated by a desire to serve her country and earn money for college through the GI Bill. Amanda had been deployed to Iraq for about 7 months and was scheduled to rotate back to the United States in just 5 weeks. She talked constantly about her plans to study veterinary medicine at the University of Minnesota and eventually return home to take over her grandfather's large animal practice. When I knelt down beside her, what I saw defied every principle of trauma medicine I had learned during my career. Amanda had sustained massive injuries to her chest and abdomen, the kind of trauma that should have resulted in immediate unconsciousness or death. I could see clear evidence of severe internal bleeding, multiple rib fractures, and what appeared to be significant damage to vital organs. Her breathing was extremely labored, requiring tremendous effort just to move air in and out of her lungs. Her pulse was barely detectable, weak and irregular, indicating severe cardiovascular compromise. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, despite the IV fluids that Lieutenant Chen's soldiers had administered using their combat lifesaver training. She was losing blood internally faster than we could replace it, and her skin had taken on the pale, grayish color that every combat medic learns to recognize as a sign of impending cardiovascular collapse and death. By every medical indicator I had been trained to rely upon, Amanda Walsh should have lost consciousness within minutes of sustaining these injuries. But she was not only conscious and
Wretch.
She was completely alert, oriented, and able to speak in clear, coherent sentences. When I introduced myself and began my medical assessment, her eyes focused on mine with obvious intelligence and recognition. She knew exactly where she was, what had happened to her, and was asking detailed, rational questions about her condition and the status of her fellow soldiers. "Sergeant Vasquez," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her obvious physical distress. "I can tell from everyone's faces that it's bad. How bad is it really? And please don't lie to me. I need to know the truth. Are Johnson and Rodriguez going to be okay? Did anyone else from the other vehicles get hurt in the blast?" I had never encountered anything like this in over 3 years of combat medicine. Patients with injuries this extensive are typically unconscious, confused, or in severe shock within minutes of the trauma. They don't engage in rational conversation about the welfare of other casualties. They don't ask specific questions about their medical treatment, or demonstrate concern for anyone beyond their immediate survival. The complete disconnect between what I was seeing medically and what Amanda was demonstrating cognitively was impossible to explain using anything I had learned in my training. As I worked to stabilize her condition, starting additional IV lines, administering pain medication, calling for urgent helicopter evacuation, Amanda continued talking in a way that defied every medical principle I understood. She was giving me detailed instructions about personal belongings she wanted delivered to specific family members. She asked me to contact her parents and relay specific messages. She even requested that I tell her grandfather she was sorry she wouldn't be able to take over his veterinary practice as they had planned. 20 minutes into treating Amanda, as I was preparing her for helicopter evacuation to the combat support hospital in Baghdad, she suddenly grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes. What she said next would haunt me for the rest of my life and ultimately change everything I thought I knew about consciousness, death, and what lies beyond our physical existence. "Sergeant Vasquez," she said, her voice taking on an urgent, almost desperate tone, "I need to tell you something important before I go." "I can see them." "See who, Amanda?" I asked, thinking she might be hallucinating due to blood loss or the medications I had given her for pain. My grandfather, he's standing right behind you, and he's not alone. There are others with him, Pulse soldiers, I think. They're all in uniform, but it's not like our uniforms, older style. And Sergeant, my grandfather died 2 years ago, but he looks exactly like he did when I was a little girl, young and strong, not sick like he was before he passed away. I looked behind me, but saw only Lieutenant Chen and her soldiers maintaining security. I turned back to Amanda, assuming this was a hallucination caused by her severe injuries and blood loss, but her eyes were clear and focused, tracking something I couldn't see. He's telling me it's okay, she continued, that it doesn't hurt where he is. He says I did good here, that I served with honor, and that Mom and Dad are going to be proud of me. But Sergeant, he's also telling me something about you that he wants me to share. Amanda, try to save your strength. The helicopter will be here in 5 minutes, and we're going to get you to the hospital where the doctors can. No, she interrupted, her grip on my hand tightening. He says you need to hear this. He says you're going to doubt yourself after today. You're going to think you failed me somehow, that maybe you could have done something different, but he wants you to know that nothing you could have done would have changed what's going to happen to me. This was always going to be how my story ended. I felt a chill run down my spine. Amanda had no way of knowing how I typically processed casualties, or that I often struggled with self-doubt after losing patience. Yet she was describing exactly the kind of thoughts that would plague me for weeks after difficult cases. He's also telling me, Amanda continued, her voice becoming weaker but still remarkably clear, that your real work isn't here in Iraq. You're going to leave the army, and you're going to help people in a different way. He says you have a gift for healing that goes beyond just medical training, but you won't understand it until after you go home. The helicopter was approaching now, and I needed to focus on getting Amanda ready for transport, but she wasn't finished talking. One more thing, Sergeant. My grandfather says to tell you that the little girl you couldn't save during your first deployment, Maria Santos, the Iraqi child who died from her injuries, despite everything you did. She's here with him. She wants you to know that she forgives you, and that her death wasn't your fault. She says you've been carrying guilt about her for 3 years, but she's okay now. I nearly dropped my medical equipment. I had never told anyone about Maria Santos, the 8-year-old Iraqi girl who died in my aid station during my first deployment. I had never spoken her name aloud to another person, and certainly not to Amanda Walsh, who I was meeting for the first time. The guilt about failing to save that child had haunted my dreams for years. As the medical evacuation helicopter landed, and the flight medics prepared to take Amanda to Baghdad, she looked at me one final time, and said the words that would change the entire trajectory of my life. Sergeant Vasquez, when you get home, find a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen in Phoenix, Arizona. She's going to need your help with something that the medical books can't explain. My grandfather says your paths are supposed to cross, and when they do, you'll finally understand why all of this happened. Amanda Walsh died 47 minutes later during the helicopter flight to Baghdad, despite the best efforts of the flight medical team and trauma surgeons at the Combat Support Hospital. The official cause of death was massive internal bleeding from multiple organ trauma, exactly what I had predicted based on my initial assessment of her injuries. But her words about things she couldn't possibly have known, about Maria Santos, about my future struggles with self-doubt, about leaving the army haunted me every day for the remaining 8 months of my deployment. How could a dying soldier, meeting me for the first time, know details about my past that I had never shared with anyone? How could she describe my future career decisions before I had even made them myself? 6 months after returning to the United States, I made the decision to leave the army and pursue civilian healthcare. I couldn't explain why, but military medicine no longer felt like where I was supposed to be. I moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and enrolled in a physician assistant program, planning to work in emergency medicine. During my clinical rotations, I met Dr. Sarah Chen, an emergency room physician, who had developed an interest in cases involving patients who reported near-death experiences or claimed to have supernatural encounters during medical crises. When I told her about Amanda Walsh and the impossible things she had known, Dr. Chen didn't dismiss my story as hallucination or coincidence. "Elena," she said, "I've documented over 200 cases of patients who demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't medically possess during life-threatening emergencies. Amanda's experience fits a pattern I've been studying for years. What she told you suggests that consciousness might persist in ways we don't understand, and that the boundary between life and death isn't as clear as medical science assumes. Today, I work as a physician assistant specializing in trauma medicine, but I also volunteer with Dr. Chen's research into consciousness and near-death experiences. We've documented hundreds of cases similar to Amanda's med patients who demonstrate awareness of information they couldn't possibly possess, who describe deceased relatives, who make accurate predictions about future events. Amanda Walsh taught me that human consciousness is far more complex and mysterious than anything I learned in medical training. Her final words to me weren't hallucinations caused by blood loss, metapaces. They were a message from someone who had briefly crossed the boundary between life and death and returned with knowledge from the other side. I still don't fully understand what happened that day in Iraq, but I know that Amanda's death changed not just my career, but my entire understanding of what it means to be human. Her last words continue to guide my work with patients who have similar experiences, and they remind me every day that there are aspects of human existence that medical science is only beginning to explore. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the patients we can't save, and the most profound healing happens not in operating rooms, but in the space between worlds where consciousness persists beyond physical death.